Welcome. This is my video for the fourth week. I do hope you're able to get in on either a Zoom session or just talking to me directly, because I need social contact. It's very important to me. We actually know it's very critical in language acquisition. If you don't have the social contact, you don't progress well, even academically. And I wanted to mention something about BICS and CALPS as I looked at this first chapter in your book, Sheltered Content. One is, we talk sheltered content because that's the way to go, because we're in the business of promoting content and instruction and teaching English at the same time and trying to persuade others to do the same thing. So we have to be aware that conversation also is not just BICS. Conversation is academic too. When you're talking, doing critical thinking, you use academic language. For instance, if you're talking about comparison, contrast, you could do that in conversation. Excuse me. I guess I'm allergic to someone. Okay. So they give you a nice set of examples of different students. They talk about Nico from Guatemala, Raul, who's an immigrant who doesn't know English, but he's educated. Nico, I have to work. Some of these guys, they have combinations. Some have good basic conversational skills in English and also in their own language, but they don't have academics. And that is one facet. That is one kind of student you'll work with. You also work with students that, the ones that have the conversational skills, and then the ones that have the academic skills, even if it's in their own language. I personally think students are probably more likely to be successful if they have the educational background. If they know how to read in their own language, the issue of reading is not going to be as difficult, even if the language reads in a different direction, left to right, right to left, up and down, or the alphabet's different. So I think that's your best situation when you have a student that's academically, because they're already prepared. They know how to write in their own language. I think the most difficult situation is to get a student that has conversational English, but has no academics at all, either language. I remember being really struck once when I had students write letters to their grandmother as a practice many years ago at Lexington, and I realized the Spanish speaker literacy skills were so poor that I couldn't even read it in Spanish. Not just misspellings, but just writing things as they sounded. And so I literally had to sound it out as I was reading it. But it distressed me because I hadn't thought about it at that time. I assumed that they had been educated and gone to school, but they hadn't. That's the gravest. To me, that's one of the most serious situations. Of course, if you have a student who has no literacy, no conversation, zero in anything other than speaking in their own language, that's also difficult. But all these students, and they're brought up in this chapter, and this is a very good chapter to read carefully, because you look at the dynamics of what skills they already have and what skills you want them to acquire. The sheltered approach, and they do talk in here about developmental bilingual, transitional bilingual, two-way immersion. These are programs, especially the ones I just mentioned, that require a lot of infrastructure and resource people and knowledgeable bilingual teachers. And Lexington has a dual language program, but I wouldn't call theirs a developmental bilingual education. They call it dual language. And there are distinctions, and I won't propose to know all of those distinctions, but my argument would be that what I think they do is they have teachers that can speak both languages, but not all of them speak both languages. Some are teaching English only, some are teaching Spanish only. And that's about as good a program as you can find under the conditions, because hiring people that are educators and are bilingual is tough, because the ones that are already there often are already, they've already been hired. They have even better opportunities. And so they may be in large cities, and you won't be able to get a cadre of them, a large number of them. So you're faced with doing sheltered workshop is the best way you can, and you do, it's like a cottage industry. In other words, you put together the best program you can with the resources you have. And if you're the only ESL teacher in the school, and if you're part-time, it's going to be even tougher. Now, for the students that struggle a great deal, you can use Title I. And people use whatever program they have. Some have migrant funds they receive to create programs. But I don't approach this class or your situation that you'll have all these options to you for a program. You're going to be reduced to probably sheltered instruction as your most advanced program. You will have you may have an English language newcomer program, but understand newcomer is for newcomers. It's not a 2-year program for newcomers. Generally, it's to get kids up to speed in terms of the culture and to understand how things work in the school system. Everything from how to use the bathroom to how to behave in the classroom, things like this. It's not so difficult with younger kids. The newcomer programs are often for older students, and they can be pretty tough because you're dealing with kids that don't have the cultural knowledge or may not have the proper deportment or behavior and have to learn that behavior. And can be cultural clash too. There are some cultures that do not take well to female teachers. They don't recognize that they have an attitude, or they have rules, and the rules are not going to work out with our rules. So those are things that you have to take into account. And then you have to decide you're going to have a pull-out program. Well, I'm not a big fan of those because I'd rather just have a 2-hour program. I don't like the word pull-out. It sounds so temporary, it's almost one day to the next, whether you do it. Problem with those programs, I've seen kids pulled out of one particular class that they really needed later. And so a child or a 5th grader doesn't go to math for the whole year because that's his pull-out program. Then next year, math is a big issue because the student has a whole year in which they didn't study math. And same thing can be, whether it's music class or, people, this is where we get into our problem with the arts. People think the arts don't matter as much. It's more important to have math than reading or social studies. And my argument would be that you're not sure which one of those is going to be the key to integrating that student, keeping them engaged. So this is another judgment you have to make. If you have a really good art teacher, that art teacher may do wonders in terms of promoting that student's dedication to education. So I look at personalities more than just subjects. Okay, so in this chapter, they introduce several people, and I've kind of given you the lay of the land. They're either low in conversation, high in conversation. They may have other things like developmental issues, special education, Asperger's or autism, or, even mental illness or stress. And those are aspects that you cannot just let people attribute those to, well, they're from another country. That's why they have this. I said, no, you may have to get in situations where you have to find or get that student tested by someone who's competent in their native language. Spanish is not too difficult. I always say a Spanish speaker who's a certified teacher in the U.S. who's a SPED professional, that's an incredible job because they can do testing in Spanish. But many of the other languages, we don't have, you're going to have to get more, you probably don't have the local people to do that kind of testing. I'm sure there are options for non-language approaches or limited language approaches, but it's not something you'll find that expertise in a local school. Again, if you teach in Lincoln, they're going to have a very broadly developed, detailed program. The things you read in here may be actually implemented there. Whereas if you're in a smaller school, some of this is going to be candy in the windows that you can't get to. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to say about this chapter. Is teaching English language just a matter of looking in a textbook? You know the answer is going to be no, but of looking in a textbook and determining, does this student know the past tense? Do they know how to use adverbs? Can they write a complete sentence? There are all kinds of parts of a language. Use of prepositions. I tell you, don't worry about prepositions. Only through extensive interaction with the language and reading will a student become more sensitive and be able to say, oh, I should say on instead of. Because prepositions are little tiny function words that vary even in our own expressions, and trying to explain them or trying to even develop them as a habit to focus on is, I think, a waste of time. I've noticed people that have PhDs still make mistakes in prepositions, and sometimes with the and an. So you want to focus on the basic structure of the language, and how do you instill knowledge of grammar in students? How do you teach that? Do you have lots of worksheets on passive sentences? Do you have lots of worksheets on how to switch from passive to active voice or using the indirect object or something? No, you don't. You may have those, you may use those, but if you do the old worksheet approach, I'm afraid you're going to lose your students. So my argument there is that reading is the key. Reading, reading, reading. I don't care. I've heard so many stories. I know Krashen had students that were from Korea. He mentioned these, and they were really struggling in a class, I think, as one of his students. And they said, well, how were they successful? These students were pretty good students, but they just didn't read very well. And he said, I think they read The Babysitter's Club in English, which had limited vocabulary, but still had an interesting story. Because you do want an interesting story. You just got to have things that are digestible, chunks of language that they can pick up, and they can follow the story. And it's scaffolded for them. So you may go through and find adolescent reading. I have some books which I can show you are high-level interest. For instance, they talk about everything from flying saucers to Bigfoot to the invention to race cars, things that a fourth, fifth, sixth grade kid might be really interested in. Maybe they like history. They want to read about the Alamo, or maybe they want to read about the weather or tornadoes or something like that. And so it's limited vocabulary. I can't say how limited, but maybe it's limited to 500 words with a little bit of support when they use a new word or something like the word tornado. When it's first introduced, they'll have a little explanation. So it's pretty obvious. And then a person can read these and have pleasure in reading. The word pleasure is very important, because if something's not pleasurable, people are not going to do it. you're eating ravioli at a nice restaurant, but the ravioli sucks, you're not going to go back to the restaurant. They lose customers. If you're reading a book on, if you give somebody a book that's too difficult, for instance, teaching Shakespeare to English language learners, very difficult. If they have limited English, you're going to have to consider whether you want to get an abridged version, which would have limited vocabulary and lots of context clues so they could follow it. I wouldn't have them watch a movie, because watching a movie is not reading. Okay, that's like Cliff Notes, or all those notes, or going to Google and looking up the outline of Hamlet or something. So when you're looking, you have to really focus on not falling in love with grammar or with all kinds of instructional approaches that emphasize the little pieces, and not realize that you have to engage the learner. So student interest is very important in this. I'm not big into students' learning style. Krashen really dislikes that. I think that's true. I think we spend too much time trying to craft our lessons to many different learning styles, and I think that just scatters our energy. We only have so much time. So I want to find something that the student is going to enjoy, that they can follow, and that they can enjoy success with. Because if the students are always frustrated, they're going to give up. They're going to just retreat. When you're listening to someone, if you're listening to me and you say, oh, here we go, another video, and you may just go in your mind, it'll just go somewhere else, and I'll just be talking along. So that's why I want to keep these fairly short, which I don't always do. But I do want to emphasize that this first chapter is good stuff. They have the iceberg theory, what you see is only a percentage of what the student may be capable of, or you can't go on just what you see on the surface, the language they produce to you. So you have to observe them. I like this, and this has been around for years. It's called the Solom Language Observation Matrix. And I like it because it's very quick and simple, and you don't have to be trained on it, but you can kind of do a rubric and kind of get an idea of where your student is in terms of on here. I mean, if they're a 3 on fluency, that means they can do everyday speech and conversation, but sometimes they have to search for the right expression. They don't have all the words available to them. So they're a 3, but if they're a 2 in pronunciation, it means they're hard to understand. They really struggle, and they have to repeat things to make themselves understood. Grammar, same thing. If they were grammar and word order number 2 on here under grammar, they make comprehension difficult because they make mistakes on tenses, or they most often have to rephrase and say something 3 or 4 times. So they're not able to just produce a fairly simple sentence that you can understand immediately. Okay, now this is oral. This is listening to them talk. So there's comprehension. Do they understand? How hesitant they are, how fluent, how comfortable they are. Is their vocabulary, do they struggle? Do they have to point at things, and so forth? Or is their pronunciation? And pronunciation is something I'd be least concerned about, even though most people are most concerned about it. Even some of the most fluent and intellectual people from other cultures that learn English may have pretty strong accent. And I've seen tests, and they actually, when they have you measure somebody's proficiency on some of the tests, they actually give them extra points if you say they have a strong accent, because they're trying to overcome your bias against them. Some people hear a strong accent and they immediately shut down. So they're trying to give the judge points the other way to try to erase that most prominent bias. This index here on page 15 is something very useful you can use. If you ever have to set up now you have the advantage of, they have other stuff in here, by the way, but you have the advantage of hopefully having a computerized system you can put data in. I used to have to use folders. And for 600 people, that's a lot of folders. Pretty discouraging when you have that many folders, really. The district's curriculum for English learners. That's on page 20. I think it's interesting because they have mainstream classes, sheltered instruction, and they give you some ideas of where you need, if you can have it, native language instruction. So if you had all Russian speakers, enough of them, you could have a Russian teacher and you could actually teach the curriculum in Russian. It'd be very critical for mathematics and even reading, because reading is reading, you know, even though it's a different language, the skill of reading and the pleasure of reading is very essential. I won't talk much about assessment other than just baseline assessments you'll get that from, in Nebraska we have, and some of you, wherever you are, you have some kind of an assessment vehicle or instrument that you use. They have a little triangle on page 23. It talks about tiers, and it talks about 3 tiers, and one is core instructional. It's like 80% of the students, hopefully you can work with them individually in class at times, but they can get through and they'll function. It's the old idea of distribution, regular distribution, or most of the people are in the middle and are not requiring special treatment. Of course, you don't know what you're going to get, what your middle is. If you got a large number of students brought into your class and none of them spoke any English, then you're going to have a very high stress situation, and you're going to have to prepare that instruction with tons of visual clues, kind of like Mrs. Amin, that little video I've had about the lady watching people teach. You know, she's teaching in Persian, but she uses puppets and animals, stuffed animals, and actual food and stuff to explain a nutrition lesson. I won't say too much about this, except that I don't know how you could assume that only 5% are going to be the group that needs the most help. That's on a regular distribution if you just had a group of people come in. But in ESL, you may get 20 people come in and all of them have no English skills at all. So they really are going to be intense. So that's from this first chapter. I do want you to read it and think about it. Sheltered instruction is the approach that most of you will use if you're teaching content. Your focus should be on, especially with students limited English academically and conversationally, you want to create conversations in your classroom in English. I like the idea of having native speakers of English. Same if you were in another country studying Spanish. You would like to have a mix of Spanish speakers with you who could give you models to imitate. So you would actually use Spanish with Spanish speakers and then hear the genuine production of language in there with their accent. And that's important. I don't think walling people off, all the students from Guatemala who have no English are all together all day, not good. I would try to avoid that. Just like going to France to learn French and all the Americans are sitting in a room with one person who's teaching them French. But you're in France. I mean, you should be reaching out and getting opportunities. That's why they do homestays and, host parents and things like that. Well, that's what I want to talk about here. Now, I mentioned that stuff about the Zoom. I want to talk to you. I don't want to sit here and tell you exactly our topic, but it's going to be about this book, but also kind of want to get into, are you going to be mainly an English elementary teacher or an English teacher who will work with ELs on occasion? Are you going to go to another country? You're going to actually teach English, conversational English to people. You're going to do it part of a mission or part of Peace Corps or part of some Fulbright scholarship or something. There's a field of English called English for Special Purposes. I haven't mentioned it, but a lot of companies will send you somewhere and they say, we want you to teach these individuals how to talk to American tourists in the hotel business. And so all the vocabulary, they'll have it planned out. You'll be working on practicing, almost instilling habits. Welcome to our Hilton hotel. And then you'll create scenarios, and you'll focus on specific situations that those individuals will face. That's actually kind of interesting. They do those also for medical. If you're going to go be a nurse somewhere and you're going to teach nursing or teach basic dental hygiene or something, to individuals. Could be companies that have going to do work with tools, specialized tools are going to make or manufacture something. So there are all kinds of jobs like that, that you specialize in. So it's not just teaching everybody how to speak English for conversational joy. It could be something else. Okay, that's all I got to say. I'm going to shut up.